We'd like to welcome you all to our latest webinar, our Veg Oils 101. We certainly appreciate you joining us. Just to let everybody know, we are going to record this, and so we can send it out to all the meeting participants. I'm sure there will be some that unfortunately won't be able to make it because we moved it from last week. We certainly apologize for that. We appreciate you being flexible. Kind of had something come up that we just couldn't quite get around. So we do apologize for that. We will do. We are planning to do our 201 next Monday. I think you probably all today would have gotten a invitation for that. If you remember the original plan, we were going to do the 101 here last week, follow up with the 201 today. We just kind of really pushed the whole process back a week. And again, very much do appreciate you being flexible with that. One of the things I think before I get started today that I did want to mention is that, we've redone this training PowerPoint deck here multiple times. We've been using a deck that we continue to refine. Been using this for, I don't know, I think we started this probably 12, 15 years ago. And what at least the way this makes sense in my little mind is that sometimes the best way to learn something is to actually do it. Well, it's sometimes difficult to do that in a training format. So you're not actually going to do it, but to try to, the first part of what we're going to go through today is to really try to help you understand the veg oil markets, not just in this country, but really globally. And I think sometimes the best way to do that is to really dig in and look at the supply-demand fundamentals. So what you're going to see today is not only a review of current supply-demand fundamentals for the veg oil markets in the US and the world. We've actually updated them with current information. And I'm not only going to try to give you a current market rundown, but more importantly, try to use that information to kind of help you understand how markets are structured, why prices change the way they do sometimes, and really the dynamics in those markets that affect those changes in price. So it's not just current market information that we're going to try to convey to you today, but really to give you that broader context of why these things are important and why we watch them and why we keep track of them. So also in this 101 session today, we'll hit just the basics of the refining process. Have a little bit of fun with that. We've got a slide that's purposefully unduly complicated so that we can scare the heck out of you and then really explain to you that, it's honestly not as complicated as maybe it seems. And after that, we'll talk a little bit about industry industry dynamics in the veg oilseed crushing, refining, and refining segment here in the United States and in North America. So we're going to try to do that all in an hour. So I will probably need to get after it here pretty quick. We are still admitting people, but
Martha's admitting them as well, so you can.
So I can just go ahead. Martha's going to admit them. Good. So I will go ahead. And get started here today. So we're going to look at world market fundamentals first. I think that that's the most important to kind of back up from 30,000 feet. It has very much become a global market. When I started in this business almost 40 years ago, we didn't watch the world markets nearly as closely as we do today. We had markets that were much more country segmented, and certainly what was happening in other parts of the world were important, but just not so much to affect prices anywhere nearly to the degree today. We've truly got global markets today that are very, very much interconnected. Something else that was very, very different when I started in this business 40 years ago is the U.S. was the largest producer of most of these ag commodities. In many of these market segments, it wasn't even close. South America was just kind of getting started in soybean and corn production and really weren't that big. Today, South America actually produces more beans than the U.S., soybeans than the U.S. does. So very much a world market, and that's where that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start by looking at the veg oil sector. One of the things that you'll notice as I'm talking about this today is I will switch back and forth between talking about veg oils and talking about oil seeds. I'll try to differentiate when I go back and forth, but what you're looking at here is veg oil production. So when you look at this top grid here and you see soybean, that is soybean oil produced. It's not soybeans produced. And again, I'll differentiate those here as we get into it. But one of the points I wanted to make with this slide is, as you can see here, if you look at the top grid, palm oil is the largest produced and traded of the world veg oils. Why is that important? Well, if you're interested in soybean oil or canola oil and you are a U.S. buyer of those, you might say, why do I care about palm oil? Well, if you look at the top two there, it's clearly palm oil and soybean oil, and those two together make up, probably at least 85% of the total. And so to some degree or another, so goes palm oil prices, so goes soybean oil prices, and vice versa. Matter of fact, if you run a price correlation over any significant period of time between soybean oil prices and palm oil prices, you find out that the two correlate in excess of 90%. That is why sometimes in the soybean oil segment, you look at the market and you look at prices going one direction or another, and you may not understand it. Why are prices going up or why are prices going down? In many cases, it's the other oil that has something going on. And the palm oil or soybean oil might be following the other major oil, some price move going on in that segment. Canola oil / rapeseed oil is number 3 on the list. Sun oil is kind of a distant fourth, and everything else is honestly, in the broader scheme of things, relatively small. Doesn't mean that some of those specialty oils aren't important. They may be very important to you, but in the broader scheme of things, palm and soy are far and away the two big ones. If you look at the bottom segment of this chart, there's some important information there as well. It's pretty much the same production data, but it is, instead of grouped by oil type, it is grouped by country of production. If you look here at Malaysia and you look at the size of the production, Malaysia produces more veg oil. Now, it's all palm oil, but Malaysia produces more veg oil than anybody else on the planet, and it's not even close. They produce almost twice as much as China in the number 2 slot there. Why is that significant to us? Well, one of the things when you find that you get in this industry and you start looking around, it becomes pretty apparent that not only is India number 1, but unlike most of the other countries on here, Indonesian production and stocks are not reported by a government entity. In fact, not that many years ago, Indonesia production and stocks were a complete black hole. They weren't reported at all. There's now an industry group that has kind of taken up the cause. They report some production data, some stocks data. Some people have questions its accuracy, but hey, at least somebody's trying. And the point that I want to make here is that the largest producer of veg oil on the planet, producing almost a quarter of everything that's produced in the whole veg oil segment, is hard to have much transparency or visibility into. This is one of the other reasons at times markets, this is one of the things that causes some volatility in the veg oil sector, is simply the largest producer on the planet. We don't have a lot of clarity as to what's actually going on. So I know transparency is good. I know it's good to be able to look at production. Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of data coming out of there. A lot of complaints at times over our USDA and the data they provide, and some people complain about the accuracy. I learned a long time ago not to do that, because comparatively to a lot of other places on the planet, we have access to pretty good data here in the US. We are pretty spoiled. Moving forward, when we look at current production and stocks data, You could see in the upper right-hand corner, there's your production data. You got 4 years worth of history. You can see the world veg oil production continues to climb slowly. If you look at stocks, we're expected to have, USDA is expecting a pretty good bump in stocks this year. And why is that? Well, I'm going to actually back up a slide to where I was. Global veg oil production is currently forecast to increase almost 4%. And if you look at the two big demand sectors here from a world standpoint, food use, which is far and away the biggest, is forecast to increase at a little over 3.5%. Biofuel use at a little under 2.5%. And so production is growing faster than supply is right now. And that is allowing stocks to build just a little bit. Why, you may ask, if stocks are growing and they're actually forecast to be at record levels, why do we have such high prices for veg oils? That would be a great question. Hold on to that one, and I will get to that here in just a little bit. When you look at those stocks that I just talked about a minute ago, most of the time in the commodity space, we not only look at stocks just in pounds or metric tons in this case, but we also break down stocks as a percent of use. How do stockpiles compare to current demand for that year? And you could see here that stocks have been growing the last couple of years. In fact, the USDA is forecasting world veg oil stocks at actually a very comfortable 14.4%. So let me give you some historical perspective on this. You might look at this chart, which is about 7 or 8 years worth of history, and say, well, what is tight and what isn't tight? On a world basis, when you look at stocks to use ratios. Well, 14.5% is what, the third highest number on this sheet. That is kind of getting into that area somewhere between comfortable and we're not quite to burdensome yet. I think when you start getting higher than 15% of use, that would be burdensome. When you start getting down here in the 12, 12.5, and certainly below that percent of use, that's where you have markets that are relatively tight. And when you get down to 10% of use on a world basis, that is considered very, very snug. Very, very snug. So that gives you a little bit of historical perspective anyway. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned it when I got started here, but if you would have any questions as we're going through this, please don't hesitate to ask. You can use the chat function. Go ahead and put your question in there, and then Paige will stop me, and we will go through and try to answer your question. Remember, I've been doing this 40 years, and some of you, I think, are very new to this market space. So sometimes I'll talk at a level of jargon that I've learned over 40 years. I don't want to confuse anybody, so certainly stop me as we get into this and ask any questions that may come up. So let's delve into the domestic market, the U.S. fundamentals, which hit a little bit closer to home for most of you on here. One of the points I want to make with this slide is that soybeans, I showed you a minute ago that soybean oil is the second largest producer of the world veg oils. It's clearly very important to the veg oil space. But it might surprise you to find out that soybean oil is really one of the only oils on that list that we don't actually grow the oil seed itself, the soybean itself, primarily for the oil. It's about the only major one on that list that falls into this category. But what do we grow soybeans for? Well, the primary reason we grow soybeans is for the high protein soybean meal. Soybean meal is a very high protein animal feed, primarily is what it's used for. Some of it goes into human consumption. But the soybean oil is, in essence, a byproduct. That will be very important as I get into some of the later slides here coming up in this presentation.
I think we did have a question.
Yeah.
I think it was maybe on the last slide.
Can you back up?
It says, is this an indication of shortness in the market? How should we interpret the percent of usage?
That's a good question here. Let me back up to this. And we'll talk about stocks to use ratio or percent of use ratio. I don't want to get too far off into the detail ditch because it can be confusing, but when you look at any individual commodity, whether you look at the absolute stocks levels or you look at those stocks as a percent of the prior year's use, what you're looking at right here very specifically in this 14.4% of use is that the USDA is telling us that their stocks, their ending stocks for veg oil that they are currently forecasting is just under 14.5% of the current demand, the total global demand that they are forecasting for all fats and oils. The reason that I said that you got to be careful with the number as an absolute is it depends on the commodity. I told you 14.4% of use when you look at world veg oils is very comfortable. Matter of fact, the USDA has been slowly increasing their forecast of that percentage for the last 4 or 5 months. When I get to domestic soybean oil stocks to use, I'll show you what I'm talking about of the difference. 8 or 9% of use is very comfortable domestically. If we were 8 or 9% of use globally for total vegetable oils, that would be considered very, very tight. When I get to soybeans, matter of fact, let me just jump back to soybeans. If you look at the stocks to use ratio down here that is being forecast by one of the economists that we work the closest with, Advanced Economic Solutions, at 6.2% on soybeans, you may say, oh my God, is the soybean market that tight this year? The answer is not really. But 6.2% of beans of use is very comfortable. It just depends on the market. I'm not going to talk about wheat today, but if you get below 20% of use on U.S. wheat, you are very, very tight. So it really depends on the specific commodity. Again, I don't think we have time today to get too far off into the detail ditch of why some commodities are comfortable at 6% of use and others are quite tight at twice that, but that's just the way that it is for some of these commodities. So back to soybeans here. Good question. Thank you very much. I appreciate you asking it. When you look at soybean, the soybean balance sheet here, I mentioned that soybeans, we produce soybeans primarily for the meal, not oil. I'll talk a little bit more about that on subsequent slides. But one of the things that our commodity risk management customers hear from us all the time, we refer to it as the soybean oil buyer's nirvana. When is life good for a domestic soybean oil buyer? Well, there's 2 answers to that question. Answer number 1 is when we have plenty of soybeans to crush. We appear to, if you look at the Advanced Economic Solutions estimate, 270 million bushels, 6.2% of use, that's enough soybeans. It's not fat and happy, but it's enough soybeans that we shouldn't have to restrict crush. USDA's currently got a little bit snugger number here, but generally speaking this year, we probably have enough soybeans to crush all that we need to crush. The other thing that you need, since we're primarily crushing the soybeans for the meal and not the oil, is enough soybean meal demand to drive that crush. So the 2 things you need to be a happy soybean oil buyer in the U.S. is you need plenty of beans, you need plenty of meal demand to drive that crush. And again, this makes soybeans different than pretty much any of the other oil seeds that we've talked about. So I said soybeans are mostly high protein meal. Generally speaking, rough rule of thumb, 20% by volume of the soybean is meal, high protein soybean meal, animal feed. 20%, actually a little bit less than that historically, is the oil. Now that is by volume. A couple of points that I wanted to make on this before I develop this theme a little bit further. You see on this chart every year, this is how many pounds of soybean oil is in each bushel of beans. Bushel of beans weighs 60 pounds. So we generally have 11.5 to 12 pounds, 11.5 to something under 12 pounds of that 60-pound bean is the oil. You also see on this chart that gives you about 10 years worth of history that there's quite a bit of volatility. We've had oil yields as low as 11.25 pounds per bushel, We had a record oil yield this year of 11.84 pounds per bushel. So what causes that oil yield to change? Well, that is a topic of much debate. But there seems to be two primary variables. You probably find it online if you're interested, but there was a very good study conducted by Iowa State University quite a number of years ago. It's probably a 15-year-old study, at least at this particular point in time. But the two primary variables that they called out both have to do with growing season weather. They have to do with temperatures in the month of August primarily, and how those temperatures fare relative to normal. Above normal temperatures for soybeans give us, generally speaking, higher oil yields. The other thing seems to be moisture stress, also in the month of August. August is a very important month for soybean development. That determines our yields. It also determines our oil yields. When I say yields, how many bushels per acre of ground we have. Oil yields is how much oil is in each bushel per acre. And with soybeans, the things that have a tendency to cause us less yield, less bushels per acre, that being heat stress and moisture stress in the month of August, also the things that cause us to have better oil yields. So you'll have a little bit of an offset. Sometimes you'll have a little bit of a bad year, like this year. We're going to have a little bit lower, at least current USDA forecast is that we will have a little bit of a subpar bushels per acre yield, but often that same thing will give us a higher oil yield. Now, it's a little bit too early in the crop cycle right now. This is last year's yields. A little too early in the crop cycle right now, but based on the weather that we experienced in the month of August, we would expect to have soybean oil yields a little bit above that historical norm. Where is that historical norm? Well, you can see in here that historical norm is probably 11.6, 11.65 bushels per acre right now. So probably have another good oil year coming. Not sure we're going to be quite as good as that record last year, but that's what things currently look like. When I get to canola here in a slide or two, I'm going to show you that the oil yield is not the same as beans. That heat you get late in a crop cycle in canola will actually cause the oil yield to go down, but more on that later. So I made the comment to you a minute ago that a soybean is generally 80 or a little over 80% meal by volume, 20 or a little bit less than 20% oil by volume. Because oil is worth more than meal per pound, the value, typically the oil historically makes up about a third of the value of the bean. The protein meal makes up the other 2/3. Now that's the historical perspective. You can see from this chart here that we have, and if you've been living in the soybean oil market for the better part of the last year or two, you know this intuitively. Certainly the oil part of the value has been carrying a much larger share here of late. Generally speaking, we've been over 40% oil share. And that by 40% oil share, what I mean is we've had over 40% of the value of that soybean is being carried by the value of the oil, historically a high number. Are we going to go back to normal anytime soon? Well, the answer to my first question is probably yes. I've been doing this 40 years and I have noticed one thing over those 40 years, and that is markets do have a tendency over time to fix themselves. They have a tendency to revert back to those historical norms. The anytime soon argument is a completely different answer. Probably not anytime soon. Why are we historically expensive? Why is oil carrying a historically larger share of the value? Well, more on that later too, but I'll give you a sneak peek. It has a lot to do with renewable fuels and renewable fuel policy, but more on that here in a little bit. So if you have enough soybeans to crush and you have enough soybean meal demand to drive crush, and we appear to have both of those this year, what is the soybean oil balance sheet going to look like? Well, if you look at the USDA right here, we ought to have enough soybean oil. There's your stock use ratios again. Honestly, we have learned to be pretty comfortable between 7 and 9% of use. You start straying below 7 and certainly below 6, you're getting very, very tight. If you look at AES's forecast here, they are forecasting a very snug 5.3% of use. That number at just over what you're looking at there is a little over 1.4 billion pounds is the forecast ending stocks coming from AES. That is probably relatively close to minimum pipeline supplies. That would be a relatively snug market. This number right here, the USDA is forecasting at over 1.8 billion pounds, is actually relatively Goldilocks. It's not too much, it's not too little, it's just right. So why the difference? Well, what you're looking at here is about 10 or 12 years worth of history on the absolute stocks number. These are in pounds. This would be 2.4, 2.5 billion pounds. Here is that very tight 1.4 billion pound number. I'm going to give you a couple things here. First, I'm going to give you something to think about. One of the things that we have noticed when you look at this as a stocks to use, and we go back and look at the last 10 or 12 years, if in fact you do have enough beans to crush, and if in fact you have enough meal demand, and it appears we have both this year, you're probably going to be okay on your stockpiles. Bill's forecast or AES forecast notwithstanding. The years in the past when we have had a problem is when you, like, if you look back here at this 2013, 2014 year, that's coming off of a crop problem year. That's coming off a year where we had a significant weather problem. We simply, because of that weather problem, we're not able to grow enough beans. And that's why you had oil stocks so tight. My bias this year would have a tendency to believe that we're probably going to have enough soybean oil because it looks to us like we have enough soybeans, at least based on the current vantage point. So let's jump over to the canola side of things. I've talked enough about soybean oil. And the reason I'm talking a lot soy and canola here, obviously we don't produce any palm in the US. I'm going to show you here in a second. Not surprisingly that the two major oils that we consume here in the US are soybean oil, canola oil, followed by palm oil. Oh, I did have one. I knew there was something else I wanted to mention here before I get off of this prior slide. Let me give you some historical perspective here. 1.5 to 2 billion pounds of oil historically is kind of that Goldilocks zone. You're starting to get a little bit snug towards the bottom of that. You're starting to get pretty comfortable towards the top of that 1.5 to 2 billion pound range. But as you can see here for the last 10 or 12 years, spent a lot of years between 1.5 and 2 billion pounds. That's the comfort zone. Above 2 billion pounds, you are getting to some degree of plenty. And above 2.5 billion pounds, you're actually getting to burdensomely large stocks. As I mentioned earlier, below 1.5 billion pounds, you're starting to get very, very snug, very, very snug. And again, minimum pipeline supplies in the US. You can't get to zero on this number. Minimum pipeline supplies in the US are probably at current usage levels, probably somewhere not too far below this forecast 1.4 billion pounds. 1.3 to 1.4 would be our current estimate. Now, there's a lot of numbers on this slide, on these slides. I apologize for that. I don't like to necessarily show you eye charts here. But look at the upper right. What is tight on canola? Well, you believe StatsCan and you believe the USDA, we ended this past crop year with a historically very, very slight, very snug, less than 1 million metric tons of ending stocks. That is very, very tight. Anybody that was in the canola market last year could feel that with the seat of their pants. Why was canola so tight last year? Well, if you look at this eye chart right here and you look at this production line, we had a historic crop failure in Canada last year. Mother Nature was not kind to the Canadian prairies. We had a historic crop failure and produced less than 14 million metric tons of production, actually probably well less than 14 million metric tons of production. So market was simply trying to ration a very tight crop. Looks like we're going to have a pretty nice rebound this year. This year's crop, maybe not quite what we thought it was a couple months ago. USDA is currently forecasting 19.5 million metric tons of production. StatsCan, which is the Canadian USDA, is forecasting something closer to 19.1. But we looks like we have a pretty nice rebound in production and stockpiles in Canada. So we should get things back to a much more normal level. When you throw US in there, US produces a very small crop relative to Canada. But when you throw that in there, US crop actually looks to be what is likely to be record large this year. Current USDA forecast about 1.8 million metric tons. So when we look broadly at US supplies of the oil seeds that we use to make our primary oils, those being soybeans and canola. Canola's got a lot more oil in it for every bushel, but we produce a heck of a lot more soybeans. Which brings me to the oil seed, the oil share argument. I was telling you earlier that soybeans are primarily produced for the meal. Historically, a third of the value comes from the oil, and a little bit less than 20% by volume of that seed, soybeans, are oil. Canola is very different. We grow canola for the oil. It is the meal that is the byproduct. Typically, canola seed, rapeseed, if you will, by volume, typically between 43 and 43.5% of that seed is the oil. And because the oil is worth so much more per pound, typically at least 2/3 of the value of the seed for canola is made up of the oil. Often, and at times like right now, with oil being very expensive relative to meal, you're over 75% of the value of that seed is actually coming from the oil. Again, that's something that makes soybeans and canola seed very, very different. And the last point that I wanted to make relative to that is that that affects planting dynamics. At times like these, where the vegetable oil is very much in demand, stockpiles are considerably tighter, and the market is demanding the oil. Why is the market demanding the oil? Well, I'll talk about biofuels here in just a second. But the market will pay for, and how does it pay? The market will pay for more true oilseed production. In fact, it's very lucrative to plant soybeans right now for a farmer. It's even more lucrative for a Canadian farmer right now to plant canola seed. And that is because the oil has got more value relative to the meal. Hopefully that was clear. I know that didn't probably come out just right. So what do we eat in the US? Well, these are the three major oils. You can see, obviously, far and away the biggest one from a food consumption standpoint is soybean oil. That's what you would expect. Number two, a distant number two, is canola, followed at a greater distance even by palm oil. Now, a couple points I wanted to make here. Point number one of the easiest things that the USDA and any commodity analyst has to predict over time is food use of vegetable oil in the US. The reason is we are a very wealthy nation. Food demand, especially for fats and oils, has proven to be very, very price inelastic. And so what that means in English is that our consumption of vegetable oil in the US grows about 1 to 1.5% a year, which not coincidentally is about what our population grows every year. Now, what does change is the makeup of that oil. In years where canola oil is very plentiful and soybean oil may be relatively more expensive or tighter, we can consume more canola oil and less soybean oil, and vice versa. At years when canola oil is tight and soybean oil is more plentiful, we will see food demand go back and forth between those two oils. In fact, our estimate would be is that there's probably 1 billion pounds of demand that will fluctuate back and forth every year based on price. Canola oil is cheaper, it will pick up a share of that 1 billion pounds. If soybean oil is cheaper, it will go the other way. What you're looking at here, these numbers, This is 14.3 billion pounds is the AES forecast for food use for soybean oil. We're looking at canola oil in food demand here in the U.S. to actually go up at about 500 million pounds. I would suspect it could go up even more than that because we've got a more plentiful canola crop, looking to lose some of that on the soybean oil side. So does the same price substitution happen with palm oil? Honestly, a lot of people wish it did. A lot of people believe it does more than what the actual history and data shows you that it does. Honestly, there's not a lot of U.S. food consumption that switches because of price with palm oil. Now, why is that? If canola and soy go back and forth with price, why does palm oil not go back and forth with price? Well, palm oil is a very different oil, primarily because it has a high degree of solids at room temperature. If you picked up a bottle of canola oil or soybean oil at the grocery store shelf, those are primarily clear at room temperature. You pick it off the grocery store shelf, it's clear, you're looking at it in a clear bottle, you can see through it. Palm oil would be partially solid at room temperature. It is what we would term a functional fat. We'll get into more of the product applications next week in the 201, but you can interchange, for example, soybean oil and canola oil readily in a salad dressing formulation. If you put palm oil in that same formulation, the salad dressing would not have the same viscosity. It would not have the same mouthfeel. It would give you a very waxy feel on your tongue. And therefore, you don't have that big substitution. So why did we have a lot of substitution back here and in years earlier? Well, if you guys remember the partial hydro ban, when the FDA banned partially hydrogenated oils, you would partially hydrogenate a soybean oil. Again, I'll get off into the functionality more next week. But we had to replace a lot of those functional fats when we threw out partial hydro. In came palm oil to fill that void. But when you get to the liquid oils like soy and canola, you really can't substitute them as readily. So let's move on into biofuels. And honestly, right now, this is the elephant in the room. You know, I posed the question earlier, if we have enough vegetable oil in the world, and we have what appears to be enough soybean oil in the US, why are prices historically so damn high? The answer is right here on this page. It's ever increasing use for fuel. Matter of fact, I should have probably paused when I showed you the soybean oil balance sheet. But if the USDA is correct, we will use almost as much soybean oil in the United States this year to make renewable fuel as we will eat. Now, we're not quite there yet, but we are getting very, very close. And it is really the soybean oil used to make renewable fuel that has been the explosive growth in soybean oil demand really for the better part of the last decade. We call it the biofuel wolf because we use the Little Red Riding Hood analogy. Many in the marketplace for the better part of the last decade on any given year have been very fearful that this is the year that the biofuel wolf is at the door and that this is the year it will consume our soybean oil balance sheet. Some debate on that this year. I showed you the AES forecast with a very, very tight 1.4 billion pounds of use. USDA thinks we're going to be in a little bit more of a comfortable range, but is really the big explosive growth in this sector has been renewable diesel. Don't want to get too far off into this detailed ditch today in the interest of time as well, but I got to tell you a little bit about renewable diesel and what makes it different than traditionally produced biodiesel. We've been making biodiesel in this country as part of our renewable fuels program for the better part of the last decade, actually 12 or 13 years. The last decade is when it has gotten big enough to notice on the balance sheet. But biodiesel, without getting too far off into the detail ditch again, is a process where you convert a triglyceride, a molecule of vegetable oil, if you will, into what is called a methyl ester. That is a product that is distinctly different than diesel fuel, but it will burn in a diesel engine like diesel fuel. Renewable diesel, on the other hand, is a process whereby you use the same piece of equipment that a petroleum refinery would use to process its distillate stream into diesel fuel. You put a vegetable oil feedstock into that piece of equipment, and what comes out the other side is what the industry terms renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is molecularly identical to diesel fuel. And that is one of the things that poses its greatest advantage and what appears to make it a better mousetrap to traditionally produced biofuel. Because it is identical to diesel fuel in its molecular structure, two things give it an advantage. Thing number one is it can go directly into the pipeline. It can go directly into storage tanks. It does not have to be segregated, which means the second thing that makes it advantageous is that you don't have any blend restrictions. With traditionally produced biofuel, biodiesel, methyl ester, it has to have its own tank. It has to have its own transportation source. It cannot go into the pipeline. It cannot go into the tank. And it can only be blended at blend rates of up to 5 to 10% to not run afoul of most diesel engine manufacturer warranties. This stuff is what's called a drop-in fuel. It can be dropped right into the right into the storage tank. It can be dropped right into the pipeline. The other thing that has changed in this industry is that a lot of these petroleum refineries, many of which have been shut down, if you remember the 2020 year, a lot of petroleum refining capacity has been shut down because our unleaded gasoline demand is dropping. These energy companies have figured out they are the ones that are obligated to blend renewable fuels based on our current renewable fuels policy. They also have unutilized pieces of equipment and pieces of property, plants, that they can now use to produce their own fuel. So not only has renewable fuel got a couple advantages to traditionally produce biofuels, but the very energy companies that are producing our diesel fuel are also producing their own renewable diesel that they are obligated to use by our renewable fuels policy. So that's the elephant in the room, and that has been really the big driver of price. And that's that is the primary reason that we are more expensive. One of the reasons that we're historically very, very expensive on veg oils. Which brings me to this chart. The red line that you see here is petroleum prices. The black line on this chart is soybean oil prices. And actually, I got that backward. The black line here is diesel, or is the red line here is soybean oil prices. The black line here is petroleum prices. And what you see here is because of the advent of renewable fuels, we have times when, as energy prices go up, they'll push the soybean oil market along with them. If there's one chart in here that is the answer to the question I pose, and that question is, why are soybean oil prices historically so expensive? It's that energy prices are expensive. You won't see soybean oil prices go back down into even the mid to low 50s as long as petroleum prices in the US are over $90 as they are today. You want soybean oil prices to break? We need energy prices to break lower. This has been a dynamic that has really only been relevant in the last 5 or 6 years of my near 4-decade career. Years ago, we just didn't watch these two markets because they didn't correlate at all. Got a question?
Yep. So the question is, why can't we use other oils than soy for renewable diesel, i.e. coconut, palm, rapeseed, hemp?
That is an excellent question. There are two reasons. And one of those reasons is a perfect segue Into the next slide. Historically, in the US, because we produce so many soybeans, we are the largest or second largest producing country when it comes to soybeans. Soybean oil in the US is typically the cheapest oil. Coconut oil is more expensive. What are some of the other oils you mentioned?
Coconut, palm, rapeseed, hemp.
All of those other oils, except palm oil right now, are more expensive. That's the primary reason. The secondary reason is that we produce so much more soybean oil in the US than any of those other oils. Third, our current government policy, palm oil is historically cheap right now. Palm oil is often cheaper than soybean oil in the world market, but it is also produced on the other side of the planet. So it isn't always cheaper in the US. It is occasionally cheaper as it is right now. Matter of fact, palm oil is historically cheap relative to bean oil right now. And one of the reasons palm oil is historically cheap relative to bean oil, even in the US currently, is that our current renewable fuel policy does not allow us to use palm oil to make renewable fuel. Now, let me clarify that. That's not actually factually correct. You can actually do it legally and not get thrown in jail, but you don't get the subsidy and you don't get the RIN credit for producing it. Therefore, it's uneconomical to use. The other reason, as I mentioned, is we make enough of these other oils. The renewable fuels, the environmental crowd, and again, I don't want to get into the politics of this, that they love the appearance of using what they would term waste oils, like used cooking oil and inedible tallow and things like that to make biofuel. The simple fact of the matter is we simply don't make enough of those to meet the mandates that we currently have in our renewable fuels policy.
So this was a follow-up question. If we had an innovation to mix any and all oils to make renewable diesel, would that help?
An innovation like another oil seed, it could. Some of the other oil seeds that are currently being looked at are things like camelina, things like pennycress. There's a whole bunch of other things you probably saw, although these are probably several years old now. I think it was an Exxon commercial that was on the TV talking about algae and extracting oil from algae. Some of those other sources could certainly help matters significantly. The difficulty with crops like pennycress and camelina and others that are planted on an acre of ground is we don't have a whole lot of extra spare acres in the US right now that we're not already planting to something. And so those would be acres that are taken from something else. Now there's talk of planting some of these crops as a cover crop, in other words, an off-season crop. That could prove valuable, unfortunately, probably only in the southern US because it simply freezes hard enough in the central and northern parts of the US growing area to actually grow a second crop on that acre of ground. But very good question. Those are all things that the industry and the market right now are trying to solve for, because the difficulty that we have is simply producing enough vegetable oil of one form or another to meet the current mandates. Europe, as you may have heard, is trying to move away from what they call first generation biofuels. First generation is code for stuff made out of stuff we eat. So we'll see how that goes.
Another question. Is it possible for the US to import more used cooking oil to fulfill the mandates?
Well, it is. That is actually happening. There's a couple problems with that. First off, there's only so much used cooking oil. And it is microscopic in volume compared to the volumes that our government has mandated for renewable fuels. That probably sounded like a political statement. I did not mean it to be. It's a reality that we're dealing with at this particular point in time. One of the other things, the other problem with it, honestly, is putting used cooking oil in large boats that burn diesel fuel and bringing them all the way across the ocean in an effort to reduce carbon emissions kind of starts to fly in the face of maybe the original goal of reducing carbon emissions, is part of the problem. One of the other things that the market is trying to do as we speak, I talked about palm oils not being substitutable as a food use. However, palm oil is historically cheap enough right now, and you can't use it to make renewable fuel in the US. But all of these waste oils, like used cooking oil and edible tallows, we call them distiller's corn oil. We call them waste oils, but they weren't taken to the landfill and they weren't wasted. They went into animal feed as an energy source. And so one of the things that is happening as we speak is we are importing more palm oil into the US that will be fed to livestock so that we can take the waste streams that we were feeding to livestock and use those to make renewable fuels. Now, you can make the argument, if you like, is it actually saving us any carbon to bring palm oil from the other side of the planet over here to feed animals so that we can take the stuff that we were feeding animals and producing here and make biofuel out of it? But again, I don't want to necessarily get into the politics of that question, so I think I will possibly just dodge it. So that said, any questions on that before we get into kind of very briefly here how the industry is made up and how we refine vegetable oils? See anything, Paige? All right. This is and I chuckle a little bit when I see this. This is purposely confusing, but it's to maybe let you off the hook a little bit. Basically, in the US today, the only boxes, if you're buying bulk refined vegetable oil to use to make a food product, it's much simpler than it was 10 or 12 or 15 years ago when we had partially hydrogenated oils. Today, we pretty much take extracted vegetable oil, a crude vegetable oil, if you will. We caustic refine it, or refining. You guys all are familiar with RBD soy, RBD canola. RBD stands for refined, bleached, and deodorized. Those are the three primary steps. Why are there three steps? Well, in the refining process, we introduce a caustic typically, we introduce water, we centrifuge the oils to basically remove the water-soluble impurities that are in that crude oil. Why do we bleach the oil? Well, a couple reasons. We like it to be lighter in color, almost water white when we pick up a bottle at the grocery store. That's certainly part of the reason. But the other reason is there are other impurities, in many cases, heavy metals in those crude oils that don't come out in the water wash step, in the refining step. The bleach, basically, it's not bleach like you would use in laundry. It's actually a clay product that is mined from the earth. The oil is filtered through that bleaching clay, as we call it. And those heavy metals and some of the color bodies that cause the oil to be darker in color in its crude state are also removed from the refined oil. And so then we deodorize it. A deodorization is a vacuum distillation process where we are simply using heat and steam to strip out the remaining, some of the remaining color bodies that cause the oil to be dark in color. And we are also steam stripping out, distilling out, if you will, some of the things that cause other oils to smell bad and taste bad. And so when you are done with those three steps, you have a product that is water white or very nearly water white. You have a product that is completely or almost completely without flavor or odor. So those are the primary three primary steps that we use today. I don't get too far off into the detail ditch here, especially in the interest of time, but back when we could partially hydrogenate vegetable oils, the industry didn't just do that to kill people, as you may have been told if you watch some of the advertising on it. Actually, we thought partial hydrogenation was actually a healthy step. Because if you remember when partial hydrogenation was invented, Back in the dinosaur days, when I was in my early days in the industry was trying to get away from palm oil, and the industry was trying to get away from animal fats because those oils were all high in saturated fat, which we thought at the time was very bad for us. In the case of animal fats, they also contained a lot of cholesterol, which we also thought was very bad for us. Science has changed, things have changed, and we have figured out that actually some of those oils may be a bit more healthful. But we could take soybean oil and turn it into just about anything you want for just about any other application that you might need in the food industry. So things have gotten a lot simpler since then. Something else I probably should mention here, some oils actually get de-waxed. Why are they de-waxed? Well, if you take corn oil, sun oil, or canola oil, in some cases, those oils at room temperature or certainly in a refrigerator will get a bit of a haze to them. They have naturally occurring waxes in them. I mention that because if you are a canola oil buyer, depending on what you are doing with that canola oil, will determine whether you need it to be de-waxed or not. If you're putting it in a bottle, that's probably a step that you might want to consider. If you're using it as a food ingredient, it doesn't make any difference at all. So, and then again, I think I'm getting a little bit long on time here. I want to try to be respectful of your time. But let's talk a little bit about the industry structure. When you look at U.S. soybean crushing, this is a breakout by market share of who's the biggest. And not surprisingly, ADM is the biggest, followed by Bunge and Cargill. The co-ops are right there with them. AGP is a cooperative, CHS is a cooperative. Those two together have about the same size share in oilseed crushing or soybean oil crushing in North America that Cargill has, and very similar to Bunge. When you look at refining capacity and you look at these percentages, not coincidentally, they are very similar. The reason is, and this is the primary message of this slide, the U.S., really the North American oilseed crushing and refining industry is almost completely integrated. What does that mean in English? That means that these companies have enough refining capacity to refine almost all of the oil they produce. I think the statistic when it comes to soybean oil in the U.S. is that 95% of the soybean oil that is refined in the United States is refined by the company that crushed the soybean. It is very much the closed system. 50 years ago, certainly slightly before I got into this industry, it was completely different. You had a very similar group of companies that were crushing the soybeans, and the biggest vegetable oil refiners in the U.S. were actually food companies. 50 years ago today, the largest vegetable oil refiner in the U.S. was Kraft, and the second largest was Wesson. Those companies are not in the business anymore. Obviously, things have changed and it has become a very integrated industry. But that is kind of a snapshot of the industry, and that's really was going to end what I was planning to talk about here today. Next week, when we get into the 201, we'll talk a little bit about pricing and how pricing is structured. We will talk about the different types of oils, and we will talk with, again, not getting too far off into the detail ditch, but we will talk about different applications and why different oils typically go into different food products. It's not happenstance. There is a rationale and a reason for it. But that said, that's where we'll leave it today. Any last minute questions popping up here before we sign off? Seen anything, Paige? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. You have our email addresses. You could email Martha or Paige here. I think Martha is the one that sent the meeting invitation out. Again, if any of you did not get the invitation for next Monday's 201, please reach out to us on that as well. And we will get you an invitation to that webinar. Appreciate you joining us today.
Make sure to stop.